picture this, right? And I mean, really try to put yourself in this specific environment. You are in Tahiti, down in French Polynesia.
Oh, gorgeous.
Yeah, exactly. The water is that impossible, almost hallucinatory shade of cyan that you usually only see in heavily filtered Instagram posts.
Right.
And you are aboard a luxury super yacht. It's called My Seanna.
Okay.
So it's season 6 of what is normally an incredibly breezy, almost soap opera-esque reality show. But suddenly, out of nowhere, this massive tow line, I'm talking a thick, heavy-duty marine rope, it just whips aggressively across the teak deck.
Oh, man.
Yeah. And in a fraction of a second, it wraps tightly around the ankle of a deckhand named Ashton Pienaar. And like, before his brain can even process the pain or the danger, he is violently yanked off the deck.
Wow.
He flies through the air, hits the water, and plunges directly into the churn between this massive moving super yacht and the smaller tender boat that's being towed behind it.
I mean, it is the absolute ultimate nightmare scenario for any mariner. We aren't just talking about a simple slip and fall here.
Right. No, not at all.
We really have to look at the physics of what is happening in that exact moment. You have a multi-ton tender boat dragging behind a 160-foot super yacht that is actively cruising forward.
Right.
So the tension on that tow line is immense. It is pulling so unbelievably tight with the sheer weight and momentum of 2 separate watercraft just working against it. The rope is it's acting less like a cord and more like a massive blunt guillotine.
God, that's terrifying.
It is.
Yeah.
It is actively threatening to completely sever Ashton's foot. Like, if that line pulls fully taut, his foot comes off. And in the middle of the open ocean, he would bleed to death in a matter of seconds.
Jeez.
This is not some manufactured cliffhanger they cooked up in an editing day. It is an immediate, terrifying, flesh and blood fight for survival.
And in that exact chaotic second, the absolute unthinkable happens for a television production. The invisible wall, that protective barrier of the camera lens that separates our safe living rooms from the harsh reality of the real world, it completely shatters.
Yeah.
A cameraman, this guy named Brent Freeburg, is looking through his viewfinder, and he realizes something chilling. Nobody else on the crew is close enough to reach Ashton in time.
Yeah, because they're all scattered, right?
Exactly. The captain is way up in the wheelhouse. The other deckhands are out of arm's reach. So Brent makes this split-second, pure instinctual choice.
What does he do?
He drops his incredibly expensive camera. He just abandons his role as a passive, objective observer. He physically breaks the reality TV fourth wall, lunges for the cleats, and actually manages to free the line. He saves Ashton's life by a margin of mere inches.
It is genuinely a staggering moment of television. I mean, you're sitting there watching what is ostensibly a glossy, slightly trashy show about spilled espresso martinis and petty arguments in the laundry room.
Right, totally.
And incredibly wealthy people on vacation, And then without any warning, you're violently confronted with the lethal dangers of the maritime workplace.
Yeah, the ocean doesn't care if you have an audience.
Exactly. The ocean doesn't care that you're filming a reality show. It will kill you regardless.
Look, we all know the Bravo formula, right? We know the beats of cable reality television. But what you probably don't know, and what we're going to get into today, is the sheer, terrifying logistical nightmare of trying to legally film 15 sleep-deprived people on a 160-foot floating bomb.
It's a huge undertaking.
It really is. So, welcome to our deep dive into the source material. Today, we were going to look way past the surface. Our mission is to unpack a show that entirely redefined the workplace docuseries, Bravo's Below Deck.
It's a fascinating subject.
Because when you dive into the sources we've gathered for this, the production histories, the maritime law requirements, the critical reception, and the raw ratings data, you realize this isn't just fluff.
Not at all.
It is a fascinating, intense psychological study of the blue-collar labor that props up extreme luxury.
That's exactly right. It's really an exploration of the logistical impossibilities of filming a television show on the open ocean. I mean, you're subject to international maritime law and totally unpredictable weather.
Oh, yeah, you can't control a storm.
Exactly. It's a case study of a franchise that started as an incredibly risky, highly experimental concept. And somehow, defying all traditional broadcast logic, it grew into a massive global television juggernaut.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the blueprint. I'm going to assume you know what Below Deck is generally, but to truly understand how wild this production is, we really have to look at how producers originally pulled off this illusion back in 2011.
Right, because it wasn't simple.
No, Because you can't just rent a super yacht like an Airbnb, slap some GoPro cameras on the wall, and tell a bunch of models to go drive it into the sunset.
No, absolutely not. The legal and financial hurdles are just astronomical. So let's look at the very first iteration. In the fall of 2011, producers booked a 5-week Caribbean charter down in St. Martin. The vessel was a 50-meter, roughly 164-foot superyacht, originally named Cor de Leone. Now, for the purposes of filming and establishing their own controlled narrative ecosystem, they temporarily renamed the yacht Honor.
Which is such a classic heavy-handed reality TV move, right?
Yeah.
Giving it a punchy, thematic name like Honor.
Totally.
But here is the part that blows my mind regarding the staffing. A boat that size requires a highly trained, synergistic crew that has spent months, if not years, learning the specific quirks, the engineering flaws, and the emergency protocols of that exact vessel.
Right.
But for the show, the original real-world crew was mostly given paid time off. They were sent home and replaced by a cast of relative strangers for this 6-week shoot.
Yes, but here's the critical caveat, and this is where maritime law forcefully intersects with television production. You cannot legally hand over a massive multi-million-dollar asset to a cast of reality television personalities.
No, of course not.
The insurance liabilities alone would just bankrupt a studio, to say nothing of the physical danger to the human beings on board. So, the production had to engineer a failsafe.
What kind of failsafe?
The actual licensed captain of the vessel, Captain Lee Rosbach, along with his first officer and his chief engineer, they were legally mandated to stay on board the vessel during the entire production.
Wait, hold on. I want to make sure I understand this dynamic. So Captain Lee wasn't originally cast to be the star of the show?
Nope.
He was just the guy who came with the rental.
Precisely. His mandate wasn't to create good television or facilitate drama. His mandate was strictly to ensure that this incoming reality TV cast didn't crash a multi-million-dollar boat into a reef and kill everyone.
Wow.
He was essentially the adult in the room, contractually obligated to remain out of sight while the quote-unquote past did the work.
It's basically like renting out a Michelin star restaurant for a month, sending the entire trained waitstaff home, bringing in a bunch of big dramatic personalities to serve the food for the cameras, but keeping the actual head chef locked in the back kitchen, just praying the building doesn't burn down.
That is a phenomenal analogy. You have these massive physical assets, complex engineering, and rigid international maritime law mixed directly with the chaotic, highly emotional demands of reality TV casting.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Right. Now, to be fair to the producers, they didn't just pluck actors out of Los Angeles coffee shops. Some of the initial cast people, like Chief Stewardess Adrienne Gang, Chef Ben Robinson, and Stewardess Kat Held, they did have actual verifiable yachting experience prior to filming.
Right, they had sea legs. But wait, before we go further into the weeds here, I think we need to define some of this jargon for the listener, because the show throws these titles around like we're all seasoned sailors, you know.
Good idea.
What exactly is a chief stew? Or a bosun? I assume they aren't just out there swabbing the deck with a mop.
It's a really important distinction because a super yacht operates on an incredibly rigid, almost military-style hierarchy. You basically have the exterior crew and the interior crew.
Okay.
On the exterior, below the captain and the first officer, you have the bosun. The bosun is essentially the foreman of the deck crew. They manage the deckhands, they oversee the physical maintenance of the yacht's exterior, they operate the heavy machinery like the cranes for the jet skis, and they are responsible for the safe docking and anchoring of the vessel.
Okay, so if the bosun screws up, the boat gets $1 million scratch on the hull.
Exactly. The stakes are very high. And on the interior, you have the chief stewardess, or chief stew. They are the equivalent of a hotel manager for a floating 5-star resort.
Got it.
They manage the lower stewardesses, they dictate the level of silver service hospitality, they handle the absurdly demanding preferences of the billionaire guests, and they manage the interior aesthetic. They're essentially the buffer between the wealthy clients and the rest of the working crew.
So you take this rigid, high-stakes operational hierarchy, and you populate it with people who were selected, at least in part because they have explosive personalities. That is a completely unique pressure cooker.
Completely.
Because you can't just storm out of the office and drive home when you're mad at your boss. You literally live with your boss in a cabin the size of a closet.
Yeah, there's nowhere to hide.
Right. And what's fascinating is how the television critics of 2013 completely missed the genius of this experiment when it first debuted.
The initial critical response was surprisingly hostile, actually. It seems many critics viewed it through the lens of traditional documentary filmmaking rather than understanding the psychological sandbox Bravo was building.
The reviews were absolutely brutal. If you look at the archives from that first season, David Hinckley, writing for the New York Daily News, gave it a deeply negative review.
What did he say?
He literally told readers they weren't well served by a show that is anchored in tedium. He called the premiere pretty mundane because he felt it lacked cohesive storylines.
Wow. Then you had Emily Yar at the Washington Post, who took a slightly different angle. She actively questioned the show's authenticity.
How so?
Well, she felt the series seemed so scripted, pointing to the stereotypical spoiled crew members and the neatly wrapped up interpersonal plot lines, that it was just impossible to take seriously, even within the famously dubious genre of cable reality shows.
And of course, the New York Times had to weigh in. Neil Genslinger completely dismissed the crew, claiming the workers weren't all that interesting to watch. But he did make one incredibly sharp observation about the wealthy charter guests who rent the boat.
Which was?
He noted that for these people, the word insufferable was invented.
Which is such a telling critique, because what Genslinger saw as a flaw, the insufferable nature of the guests, was actually the core psychological engine of the entire series.
Right.
The producers were deliberately capturing that tension. It's the extreme, unchecked entitlement of the billionaire class juxtaposed directly against the physical, exhausting labor of the working class.
But I don't buy that the critics speak for the public. They clearly didn't. Because despite all these high-minded reviewers calling it tedious, mundane, or overly scripted, the actual viewership numbers told a wildly different story.
The audience response was undeniable. By August of 2013, Bravo released the data showing that the first season averaged 1.4 million total viewers per episode.
That's huge.
In the landscape of new, unproven cable reality shows, that is a staggering number. It proved that Bravo hadn't just made a quirky boat show, they had stumbled onto a highly addictive psychological formula.
Yeah, they struck gold.
And that massive viewership guaranteed a second season, which is really where the messy experiment finally evolved into a well-oiled machine.
Moving into season 2, which dropped in August 2014, the show really starts to find its sea legs. But they don't just stay on the same boat. And this is something we should definitely touch on. Every few seasons, they change the massive multi-million-dollar vessel. In season 2, they move to a 153-foot yacht called Ohana down on the British Virgin Islands. Later, they jump to a 161-foot yacht called Arrows in the Bahamas, and then another called Valor in the U.S. Virgin Islands. What does that actually mean for the crew?
It's a logistical nightmare. Imagine being a professional driver, and every month someone hands you the keys to a completely different prototype hypercar and says, drive this flawlessly, immediately.
Oh man, that sounds stressful.
It is. Every yacht has different engineering quirks, different blind spots from the wheelhouse, different spatial limitations in the galley for the chef, and different emergency protocols. The crew has to board these new vessels and essentially master them in 24 to 48 hours before the cameras start rolling and the first charter guests arrive.
That's insane.
It intentionally keeps the crew off balance, which inherently generates stress and, by extension, compelling television.
That makes so much sense. It's a forced learning curve. But while the boats are constantly changing, season 2 is really defined by the formation of what I like to call the golden era cast. The show realizes it needs an anchor.
Absolutely.
You have Captain Lee Rosbach, who, remember, was originally just the silent safety net in the wheelhouse. Now he steps fully into the limelight as this stern, unyielding, deeply principled father of the boat.
Yeah, he becomes the face of it.
You have Chef Ben Robinson returning with all his manic culinary genius energy. You have Eddie Lucas, who is a great case study because we actually watch him grow from a green deckhand in season 1 into the bosun by season 2.
Those three are vital, but perhaps the most crucial addition to the franchise's long-term DNA happens in season 2 with the introduction of a new chief stewardess, Kate Chastain.
Oh, Kate is iconic.
When Kate arrives, the entire dynamic of the show shifts. She brings this dry, highly intelligent, almost cynical wit to the interior management. What the producers realized is that the management tier of the boat, Captain Lee, Kate, and Chef Ben, provided a comforting, reliable consistency that the audience could latch onto week after week.
Right, the management is the anchor because the lower-level deckhands and the junior stews are just a relentless revolving door of absolute chaos.
Oh, complete chaos.
You have people coming on board who clearly have no business being on the ocean. There was Andrew Sturby in Season 2, who famously lied on his resume and only lasted 4 episodes before getting fired.
I remember that.
Or Rocky Dakota in Season 3, who practically treated the yacht like her own personal performance art stage. The lower ranks are turning over constantly.
And that turnover is the lifeblood of the show's narrative structure. As the San Francisco Chronicle critic David Wigan astutely noted, the show takes the incredibly basic concept of disparate personality types thrown together in a tightly controlled environment, and it capitalizes on 2 inevitable human results: interpersonal friction and extreme sexual tension.
Yep, that's the secret sauce.
With Season 2 and beyond, the show successfully pivoted from what started as a somewhat dry, operational look at yachting into a highly character-driven, emotionally volatile workplace drama.
And as they dialed in this exact formula, the strict, uncompromising captain, the wry, hyper-competent chief stew, the temperamental, perfectionist chef, and a constantly rotating cast of chaotic 20-somethings, the audience just grew. It wasn't just a flash in the pan. The growth was organic and steady.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the data illustrates a textbook case of audience acquisition. Season 2 averaged 1.07 million viewers. By Season 3, as the Kate and Lee dynamic really solidified, it climbed to 1.27 million.
Wow.
By Season 4, it hit a 1.41 million average. What you are seeing is the perfection of a highly specific, infinitely repeatable engine for television.
It's the classic upstairs-downstairs class conflict. You have the wealthy elite upstairs demanding the world, and the exhausted working class downstairs trying to provide it, all contained within a claustrophobic, floating tin can where literally no one can escape.
It's the perfect setup.
If you hate your coworker, you still have to sleep 3 feet away from them in a bunk bed.
Precisely. It's a pressure cooker specifically designed by its environment to force confrontation. But what elevates it above standard reality TV garbage is the actual real-world requirement of the job.
Right, they actually have to work.
They can scream at each other in the crew mess, but if they don't execute high-end service, the charter fails, the guests withhold the tip, which is a massive amount of their income, and the captain will fire them. The stakes are financial and professional.
But just as the show perfected this breezy, predictable formula, where the biggest, most traumatic stakes seemed to be whether the chef remembered a guest's bizarre dietary restriction or who was covertly hooking up in the guest cabins, Season 6 arrived. And it delivered a dose of reality so severe it fundamentally altered the DNA of the franchise.
Which brings us right back to the terrifying moment we discussed at the top of the show. Season 6 takes place in Tahiti, aboard the My Seanna. It premiered in late 2018. The show was riding high, but then we hit Episode 11.
The Ashton Pienaar man overboard incident. I really want to linger on the aftermath of this, because it represents such a profound paradigm shift. We talked about how Brent, the cameraman, had to drop his gear and physically intervene to save Ashton's life. But what happens after they pull him out of the water? How does a superyacht crew and a television production crew process a near-death experience?
The immediate aftermath is chillingly sobering. The show doesn't do what a typical reality show would do, which is milk it for interpersonal drama and move on. The gravity of this situation completely halts the momentum.
Yeah, you could feel it through the screen.
Captain Lee, who we have to remember is a heavily seasoned mariner with decades of legitimate sea experience, is visibly, deeply shaken to his core.
You can see it in his eyes. He knows exactly how close he came to having to call a mother and tell her that her son died on his boat.
Exactly. And mechanistically, things changed immediately. Captain Lee instituted strict, non-negotiable new procedures on the deck. He mandated entirely new protocols for how the lines are handled, where crew members are permitted to stand during towing operations, and how communication is relayed between the aft deck and the wheelhouse.
He wasn't taking any chances.
Not at all. He recognized that complacency had seeped into the crew, perhaps exacerbated by the presence of the cameras, and he ruthlessly stamped it out to ensure a near-fatal accident like that could never happen on his watch again.
Which raises an incredibly tough question, and I really want you, the listener, to think about this. Does real-world, flesh-and-blood trauma like this change the ethical contract between the viewer and a reality show?
It's a great question.
We tuned in for the escapism, right? We came for the spilled drinks, the petty gossip, the beautiful sunsets, and suddenly we're watching a man seconds away from losing a limb or his life. We are watching real-world mortality aggressively invade our Friday night escapism. Are we complicit in this danger by demanding more extreme television?
It's a vital ethical question, and it fundamentally altered the broader cultural perception of the show. Earlier, we talked about critics like Emily Yarr at the Washington Post who dismissed the show as feeling entirely scripted or manufactured.
Right.
The Ashton incident eradicated that specific critique instantly and permanently. It proved to every skeptic, every viewer, and every media analyst that the maritime workplace they were documenting was 100% authentic. The dangers inherent to operating these massive vessels, dealing with heavy machinery and unpredictable ocean currents, were not cooked up by story producers in a writer's room.
And ironically, or maybe darkly, the audience did not turn away from the danger. They flocked to it. The ratings boom for Season 6 is just staggering. Episode 11, the specific episode featuring the accident, pulled in an astonishing 2.11 million viewers.
That is massive for cable.
It remains the series' peak. And it wasn't just a morbid one-off. The subsequent episodes held that audience, driving the entire Season 6 average to 1.43 million.
And that intense momentum carried directly into the following year. Season 7 returned to the yacht Valor, this time filming in Phuket, Thailand. And crucially, Ashton Pienaar actually returns to the cast.
Wait, really? After all that?
Yes. He didn't quit the industry. He came back, having been promoted to bosun, working alongside Kate Chastain and a new chef, Kevin Dobson. The audience was deeply invested in his recovery and his new leadership role, and Season 7 rode that wave to a massive 1.56 million viewer average.
This ratings peak was the ultimate green light. It proved to the executives at Bravo that Below Deck wasn't just a reliable mid-tier performer, it was a cultural juggernaut capable of pulling network-level numbers.
Absolutely.
And so they did what any television network does when they find a golden goose. They rapidly, aggressively expanded the universe. But they were spinning up this massive global franchise just as real-world global events were about to slam on the brakes for the entire planet.
The expansion strategy was incredibly ambitious. The network began launching what we can essentially call the franchise fleet. They had already dipped their toes in the water back in 2015 by launching Below Deck Mediterranean, which cruises the world's oldest and most historic yachting grounds. But by 2019 and 2020, the expansion truly explodes.
They introduced Below Deck Sailing Yacht, which is a completely different logistical beast.
Oh, completely.
Because they were following a crew aboard a massive sailing yacht, the Parsifal III, in Greece. Sailing yachts heel over. The physics of serving dinner at a 30-degree angle are insane.
Plates sliding everywhere.
Exactly. Then the streaming service Peacock orders Below Deck Down Under, set in the waters of Australia. And eventually we get Below Deck Adventure focusing on cold water excursions. They are attempting to blanket the globe in Bravo cameras.
But as this franchise reaches its absolute global zenith, we arrive at Season 8 of the flagship show. They are back on My Seanna, this time filming in Antigua. It premieres in November 2020.
Okay, 2020. That year alone says a lot.
Yes. And immediately, there is a massive internal shift that rattles the fan base. Kate Chastain, the chief stew, who essentially defined the tone and humor of the show for 6 straight seasons, has officially departed. She's replaced by a new chief stew, Francesca Ruby.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you would think the biggest storyline of the season would be how the crew adapts to life without Kate. But that internal casting shakeup is immediately, violently overshadowed by a real-world macroeconomic collision. Season 8 is filming in early 2020, right as the COVID-19 pandemic begins its initial sweep across the globe.
It is a profound collision of circumstances, because Below Deck as a concept is uniquely vulnerable to global macro events. Think about the core requirements for this show to even exist.
Travel.
Exactly. It relies entirely on seamless international travel. It requires open borders. It requires extraordinarily wealthy tourists willing to fly across the world to step onto a boat. And it requires a crew sourced from multiple different continents, South Africa, Australia, Europe, America, to fly in and work together. If global travel stops, the entire premise of the show literally ceases to exist.
And we, as the viewers, literally watch that existential threat unfold in real time on screen. It is so eerie. The season is suddenly curtailed. The final 2 charters are entirely canceled because the world is locking down.
Yeah, they had no choice.
You are watching these young crew members, isolated on a luxury yacht, moored in Antigua, slowly getting fragmented news alerts on their phones about this mysterious, deadly virus.
It creates this fascinating, high-anxiety time capsule. While the network was hyping the expansion of the spin-offs, Season 8 grounds everything to a terrifying halt. You watch the production team completely scramble behind the scenes, trying to figure out how to get a multinational crew safely back to their respective home countries before the international borders slam shut indefinitely.
But wait, here is the paradox. You would think watching a show about a pandemic, while living through a pandemic would be too depressing for viewers.
You'd think so, yeah.
Yet despite the real-world anxiety bleeding into the episodes, the ratings held incredibly strong. Season 8 still averaged 1.49 million viewers. How do you explain that?
I think it really comes down to the psychology of escapism. You had a captive, lockdown global audience. Hundreds of millions of people were legally confined to their living rooms, terrified of the outside world. You couldn't travel, you couldn't see your friends.
Yeah, we all remember that feeling.
But you could turn on Bravo and watch a pristine white superyacht cruise around the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. Even as the on-screen crew faced the very beginning of the same pandemic the viewers had been enduring for months, the sheer beauty of the scenery provided a bizarre, necessary psychological comfort.
It was pure visual therapy. But while the show itself miraculously survived the pandemic, navigating insane testing protocols and quarantine bubbles to return to filming for Season 9, it was about to face a much bigger, much more permanent internal challenge.
Yes. The loss of Captain Lee.
Right. The slow, turbulent, and painful loss of its absolute North Star.
This brings us to a massive structural changing of the guard and the harsh ratings realities that followed. Let's look at the timeline. Season 9, they're back on the My Seanna, this time in St. Kitts, but Captain Lee is delayed.
What happened?
Due to a medical issue, he cannot join the boat for the start of the charter season. For the first 2 episodes, Captain Sean Meager steps in to run the boat before Lee can finally return.
It seems like a small disruption, just a couple of episodes. But looking back, it was a massive harbinger of things to come. The cracks were really starting to show.
Exactly. Because then we get to Season 10. The show moves to a massive, incredibly complex new yacht, the St. David. And midway through this season, the unthinkable happens. Captain Lee, the man who has been the steadfast face of this entire franchise since day one, is physically unable to continue.
It was so sad to watch.
It was. He is forced to leave the boat between episodes 5 and 14 due to severe nerve mobility issues.
And to cover his absence, the network does something totally unprecedented. They bring in Captain Sandy On, the polarizing captain from Below Deck Mediterranean, as a crossover to take over the flagship show.
Which is a huge deal for fans.
It is a massive shock to the system for the crew and the viewers. Lee does manage to return through sheer willpower to finish the season. But the writing is permanently on the wall. The era is ending.
Which leads directly to Season 11, premiering in February 2024. This marks the official permanent end of an era. Captain Lee is gone. He's officially replaced by Captain Carey Titheridge, who came over from the Adventure spinoff. The entire crew dynamic shifts to adapt to his leadership style. The core narrative now features Fraser Olander, who has worked his way up to chief steward, and Ben Willoughby acting as the lead deckhand and eventually stepping into the bosun role.
And the drama clearly hasn't stopped under the new regime. We're looking ahead to Season 12, which is slated to premiere in 2025, again on the St. David. The promotional trailer for it features an incredibly intense tease where Captain Carey actually has to cancel a charter in the middle of the season.
We really need to contextualize what that means. In the world of high-end yachting, canceling a charter is the absolute nuclear option.
Oh, totally.
You are refunding hundreds of thousands of dollars. You are destroying the reputation of the vessel among the elite yachting brokers. A captain only pulls that ripcord if the safety of the vessel is fundamentally compromised or if the guests are engaging in highly illegal activity. It is catastrophic.
I can't wait to see how that plays out. But as this new era with Captain Carey tries to find its footing and generate that kind of explosive drama, we have to look closely at the cold, hard viewer data. Because the ratings show a drastic, undeniable, and concerning decline.
The numbers definitely tell a story.
We mentioned the show was peaking around 1.5, even 1.6 million viewers. Season 10 drops to an average of 1.7 million. Season 11 plummets even further to 0.78 million. And the early projections for Season 12 are sitting at an average of roughly 0.61 million.
This is the central debate for media analysts looking at the Bravo ecosystem. What is causing a viewership drop of this immense magnitude?
Right, why are people leaving?
The primary theory is extreme franchise fatigue. When you have the flagship Below Deck plus Med plus Sailing Yacht plus Down Under and Adventure all airing continuously nearly year-round, does the core concept lose its specialness? The market is just entirely saturated with yacht drama.
Wait, I hear the fatigue argument, but I don't think it's just that. When you build a television show around the premise of incredibly high turnover, always firing deckhands, always bringing in new, inexperienced stews, what happens when you finally turn over the one person who was supposed to be permanent?
You mean Lee?
Yes. Captain Lee was the anchor. Kate Chastain was the rudder. When you lose the legacy cast members, you don't just lose familiar faces, you lose the actual identity of the show.
That is a very strong counterpoint. You can only dilute a brand so much and swap out so many essential parts before the original flavor that hooked people completely vanishes.
Right.
But even as we analyze this ratings decline, we have to zoom out and acknowledge the massive lasting footprint of this show. Because its impact didn't stay confined to reality television, it made a significant, highly controversial splash in the actual real-world maritime industry it attempts to portray.
Let's revisit a really sharp critique from the sources. Sandy Malone, writing for the Huffington Post way back in 2014, posed a very serious existential question about the show. Is Below Deck actively hurting the yachting industry by destroying its reputation for stellar, discreet service?
It is a completely valid concern from an industry perspective. Think about the target demographic for yacht charters. If you are an ultra-high net worth individual, a billionaire thinking about dropping $250,000 for a 3-day vacation, discretion and flawless service are paramount.
They want perfection.
Exactly. But if you watch Below Deck, your primary association with yacht crews is that they're going to spend the entire charter screaming at each other in the galley, ignoring your drink orders, and prioritizing their own romantic drama over your vacation.
Exactly. I mean, if I have that kind of money, wouldn't I specifically demand a non-reality TV crew? How do these boats even get chartered if the public reputation of a yachty is now synonymous with reality TV garbage?
It creates a tremendous tension between entertainment value and professional reputation. The show operates as a massive double-edged sword for the maritime industry. On one hand, yes, it commodifies their mistakes and portrays the workforce as chaotic, highly dramatic, and incredibly prone to error for our entertainment.
But on the other hand,
it has single-handedly brought an unprecedented level of global awareness to the yachting industry.
oh, for sure.
Before 2013, working on a superyacht was a niche, hidden industry. You had to know someone in Antibes or Fort Lauderdale to even get a foot in the door. Below Deck introduced a highly lucrative, adventurous career path to millions of young people globally who never would have known this job existed. It supercharged the recruitment pipeline.
And speaking of that global reach, we absolutely have to talk about the geographic data in the viewership, because there's this bizarre anomaly. The Canadian phenomenon.
Yes.
Below Deck didn't just succeed in the U.S., it developed a massive, rabid, dedicated cult following in Canada.
The broadcast history there is really fascinating. For the first 5 seasons, it aired on the Canadian E! Network, often holding the exact same primetime slot as the U.S. broadcast. It was a flagship show for them. Then, starting in season 6, it was picked up by the Slice Network, where it continued to completely dominate reality TV ratings.
But wait, look at the geography. Why is a show entirely centered around tropical, sun-drenched environments, Caribbean islands, and open water swimming becoming a massive hit in a country known globally for its harsh, freezing winters?
What's fascinating here is that it speaks perfectly to the psychology of media consumption in different climates. In sociology, there's a well-documented concept regarding how humans use media to regulate mood, especially in environments prone to long winters and seasonal affective disorder.
That makes total sense.
For a viewer in Alberta or Ontario in the dead of February, when it is negative 20 degrees outside, turning on Below Deck isn't just watching a reality show. It is pure, distilled, intravenous wish fulfillment. It is a portal to warmth, sunlight, and total lack of physical restriction.
And it wasn't just a passive one-way viewing experience. The Canadian audience loved the show so much and became so enamored with the industry that they actually started leaving Canada to appear on the show as crew members.
Yeah, we saw a few of them.
You had Chef Matt Burns from Ottawa, who came on to run the galley in Season 5, and then Courtney Skippon from British Columbia, who joined as a stewardess in Season 7. The show literally reached out through the television screen, grabbed an audience shivering in the snow, and pulled them right onto the teak deck of a Caribbean superyacht.
Which ultimately proves the universal appeal of the core psychological formula. Whether you are watching from a high-rise in New York, a snowy cabin in British Columbia, or a flat in London, the dynamics at play, grueling physical labor, extreme untouchable wealth, and raw interpersonal conflict are universally understood human experiences.
It truly is an incredible voyage when you step back and look at the whole picture we've painted today. We've tracked a show that started as a highly manipulated, legally dubious, almost overly engineered TV experiment in St. Martin back in 2011, a show that the top television critics in the country smugly dismissed as mundane and anchored in tedium.
And we watched that fragile experiment evolve against all odds into a massive multi-continent franchise. A franchise that survived a near-death accident that literally shattered the fourth wall.
Yeah, that was wild.
A show that weathered constant cast mutinies, outlasted a global pandemic that completely shut down the international travel industry it relies on, and somehow navigated the profound structural loss of its iconic founding captain.
So what does this all mean? When you strip away the million-dollar hulls, the five-star caviar meals, and the impossibly blue waters of Tahiti, what is Below Deck actually saying to us about the world we live in?
I believe it reveals the incredibly fragile human infrastructure that is required to support extreme luxury. It pulls back the curtain to show us that the concept of a perfect vacation or flawless service is entirely an illusion.
A total illusion.
And that illusion is maintained by exhausted, heavily flawed, deeply stressed human beings working under immense physical and psychological pressure. It humanizes the invisible labor class of the ultra-rich.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to mull over long after this audio ends. We live in a culture that is utterly obsessed with acquiring wealth and curating the absolutely perfect, frictionless Instagram aesthetic. But perhaps the true, enduring genius of Below Deck is the stark reminder that absolutely no amount of money can insulate you from human nature.
Exactly. You can pay $250,000 to rent a super yacht. You can demand the absolute finest vintage champagne and the most pristine, isolated ocean views on Earth.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, your perfect paradise is entirely in the hands of a 22-year-old deckhand who is operating on 4 hours of sleep, nursing a hangover, and currently furious at their manager.
Think about that the next time you book a getaway and expect absolute perfection. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating, chaotic, and legally perilous world of Below Deck. Keep questioning the reality you see on screen, look a little closer at the labor behind the luxury, and as always, stay insanely curious.